Part of the climb was smooth, then the aircraft passed through the wake left behind by the departing jumbo jet. The airplane jolted suddenly. Small disturbances like this are common and usually harmless. But inside the cockpit, the first officer reacted aggressively, pressing the rudder pedals sharply to keep the aircraft aligned. He pushed left, then right, then left again, each movement swinging the tail harder than the last. Within seconds, enormous forces began building at the rear of the aircraft. The vertical stabilizer, the large tail fin that keeps the airplane stable in flight, was suddenly pushed far beyond the loads it was designed to handle. Then it failed. The entire tail fin tore away from the aircraft and fell into Jamaica Bay. With the stabilizer gone, the airplane instantly lost its ability to remain stable in the air. The jet rolled violently as the two engines also separated from the wings under the extreme stress. Below them, the quiet residential neighborhood of Bell Harbor in Queens was directly in the aircraft's path. Witnesses on the ground looked up to see the jet descending rapidly with pieces already missing. Seconds later, the aircraft slammed into the neighborhood, sending a massive fireball into the sky. All 260 people on board were killed, along with 5 people on the ground. At first, many feared the worst. In a city still traumatized by recent attacks, the crash immediately raised fears of another act of terrorism. Fighter jets scrambled and bridges across New York were temporarily closed. But as investigators recovered the wreckage, a different and more tragic explanation began to emerge. The disaster was not caused by a bomb or a missile. It came from a series of powerful control inputs that pushed the aircraft's structure far beyond its limits. American Airlines Flight 1420. On the night of June 1st, 1999, an MD-82 operated by American Airlines was approaching Little Rock, Arkansas after a delayed flight from Dallas-Fort Worth. On board were 145 people, including passengers and crew. What was meant to be a short evening trip had already been pushed late because of bad weather moving across the region. As the aircraft neared Little Rock, a line of strong thunderstorms was passing directly over the airport. Lightning flashed across the sky and heavy rain moved across the runways. Air traffic controllers warned the crew about gusty winds and rapidly changing conditions. The pilots faced a difficult decision. Low-cost airline that had quickly become popular for its cheap fares. The flight was scheduled to travel from Miami to Atlanta with 110 people on board. Families, tourists, and business travelers filled the cabin expecting a short trip north across Florida. The aircraft pushed back from the gate after a delay caused by electrical issues earlier that afternoon. Once the problem was signed off, the flight taxied out and lifted smoothly into the warm Florida sky. From the ground, the jet climbed west over the vast wetlands of the Everglades, beginning what should have been a routine 1-hour flight. About 6 minutes after takeoff, something strange began happening inside the cabin. A faint burning smell drifted through the air. Some passengers noticed it first, followed by a dull thump from below the floor. Moments later, the lights flickered and the intercom stopped working. A flight attendant rushed toward the cockpit and shouted the word every pilot fears hearing during flight: fire. The source of that fire was hidden beneath the passengers inside the forward cargo compartment. Boxes loaded into the hold had been labeled as harmless company material, but inside were more than 100 chemical oxygen generators. These devices are normally used to supply oxygen masks if a cabin loses pressure. They were old, improperly handled, and missing the protective caps that prevent them from activating. As the aircraft taxied and climbed, at least one of the generators triggered. The device began producing intense heat and pure oxygen, quickly setting off others nearby. Within minutes, the cargo hold turned into a furnace. The fire burned hotter and hotter while feeding on its own oxygen supply, something normal fire suppression systems could not easily stop. Up in the cockpit, the pilots declared an emergency and requested an immediate return to Miami. Air traffic control cleared them to turn back toward the airport. Their voices sounded calm but urgent as smoke began spreading through the aircraft. Behind them, the fire was already burning through electrical cables and structure beneath the cabin floor. Outside, people in the Everglades would soon see the aircraft descending rapidly toward the swamp. What they did not know was that inside the airplane, the situation had already passed the point of recovery. TWA Flight 800. On the evening of July 17, 1996, a Boeing 747 prepared for departure at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The aircraft was TWA Flight 800, scheduled to fly across the Atlantic to Paris before continuing on to Rome. On board were 230 people, including families, tourists, students, and business travelers beginning an overnight journey to Europe. The weather was clear and calm as the massive jet lifted off from the runway and climbed out over Long Island. From the ground, the aircraft looked like thousands of others that departed New York every year. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats for the long flight ahead, while the crew guided the aircraft steadily upward toward cruising altitude. About 12 minutes after takeoff, the airplane was climbing over the Atlantic Ocean just south of Long Island. Air traffic controllers watched the radar target moving smoothly away from the coast. Then, without warning, the radar symbol disappeared. At the same moment, dozens of people along the coastline saw something shocking in the evening sky. Witnesses on beaches and boats reported a sudden flash of light followed by a massive fireball high above the ocean. Pieces of burning debris began falling toward the water, leaving bright streaks across the darkening sky. In only a few seconds, the giant aircraft had broken apart in midair. There was no distress call, no warning to the passengers or crew. The forward section separated while the center of the fuselage ripped open and the wings and tail came apart as fuel ignited in the air. The wreckage fell into the Atlantic about 8 miles off the coast of Long Island. Everyone on board was lost. What followed was one of the largest aviation investigations in American history. Navy ships, Coast Guard vessels, divers, and aircraft rushed to the crash site as wreckage floated across the ocean's surface. Investigators would soon begin the enormous task of recovering thousands of pieces from the sea, trying to answer a question that quickly spread across the country. What could cause a fully functioning Boeing 747 to explode in the sky only minutes after takeoff from New York? United Airlines Flight 232. On July 19, 1989, a wide-body DC-10 departed Denver on a routine afternoon flight to Chicago. The aircraft was United Airlines Flight 232, and on board were 296 people, including passengers and crew. For nearly an hour, the flight was calm. The airplane cruised high above the fields of the American Midwest, while passengers read, talked quietly, or looked down at the endless patchwork of farmland below. Then at 3:16 in the afternoon, everything changed in a single violent moment. A loud explosion shook the aircraft as the tail-mounted engine suddenly disintegrated. Metal fragments tore through the rear section of the airplane. Within seconds, the crew realized something far worse had happened. All 3 hydraulic systems had been destroyed. On a jetliner like the DC-10, the hydraulics control almost everything. The ailerons that roll the aircraft, the elevators that raise and lower the nose, and the rudder that keeps the plane stable all depend on hydraulic pressure. Without it, the pilots could barely control the airplane at all. Inside the cockpit, the captain and first officer tried the controls, but the aircraft barely responded. Warning lights filled the instrument panel as every hydraulic gauge dropped to 0. The airplane began to roll and pitch unpredictably in the sky. There was no checklist for a complete hydraulic failure because engineers had believed such an event was nearly impossible. Then an unexpected helper arrived. Among the passengers was Denny Fitch, a DC-10 training captain traveling off duty. He came forward to the cockpit and joined the crew in a desperate effort to control the aircraft. Together they discovered a fragile method of steering the crippled jet. By adjusting the power of the 2 remaining wing engines, they could slightly change the direction of the aircraft. It was crude and unpredictable. Every throttle movement took seconds to respond and often pushed the airplane too far. The aircraft began moving in wide rolling motions while slowly losing altitude. Air traffic control guided them towards Sioux Gateway Airport in Iowa, the nearest airport with a long runway. For nearly 40 minutes, the crew fought to keep the damaged airplane pointed toward the runway using nothing but engine power. Everyone on board understood one thing: they would the nose lifted smoothly into the air. For a second, the aircraft actually left the ground. But almost immediately, something was wrong. With the wings in the wrong configuration, the airplane struggled to stay airborne. The climb was weak, and the aircraft began to sink back toward the ground. Only seconds after liftoff, the left wing struck a light pole at the edge of the airport, tearing open the fuel tank. A burst of fire followed as the aircraft rolled and descended toward a nearby road just beyond the airport boundary. What happened next would become one of the deadliest aviation disasters in Michigan history. Delta Airlines, Flight 191. On the evening of August 2nd, 1985, a wide-body jet approached Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport after a routine flight from Fort Lauderdale. The aircraft was Delta Airlines Flight 191, a Lockheed L-1011 carrying 163 people. From the cockpit, the airport lights were already visible in the distance, but so were the dark, towering clouds of a thunderstorm building just off the approach path. Storms near major airports are not unusual, and pilots are trained to work around them. The crew could see lightning flashing ahead and sheets of rain hanging beneath the clouds, yet it looked possible to slip under the edge of the storm and land before conditions worsened. With the runway only minutes away, they continued the approach. As the aircraft descended toward runway 17, the jet flew into a curtain of heavy rain. Suddenly, the airspeed began to increase. The airplane had entered strong headwinds at the front of the storm. To remain on the proper glide path, the pilots reduced power, expecting the winds to remain stable. But hidden inside the storm was a violent phenomenon few crews fully understood at the time. Without warning, the powerful headwind collapsed and flipped into a strong tailwind. At the same moment, a powerful downdraft pushed the aircraft downward. The jet was now flying into what meteorologists call a microburst, a sudden column of descending air that can force an aircraft toward the ground faster than engines can recover. Inside the cockpit, the airspeed dropped rapidly. One pilot warned about the speed, while the captain pushed the engines to full power. But the aircraft was already too low and too deep inside the collapsing winds. Seconds later, the L-1011 slammed into the ground just short of the runway, beginning one of the most devastating crashes in American aviation history. Air Florida Flight 90. On January 13, 1982, Washington, D.C. was locked in one of the worst snowstorms in years. Thick snow covered the city, traffic crawled through frozen streets, and the Potomac River beside the airport had turned into a dark field of drifting ice. At Washington National Airport, a Boeing 737 waited on the runway. It was Air Florida Flight 90, scheduled to fly south to Florida with a stop in Tampa. On board were 79 people, including 74 passengers and 5 crew members. For them, it was supposed to be nothing more than a routine winter flight. But the storm had already started to change the story. The aircraft had been sprayed with de-icing fluid at the gate, yet it sat too long in falling snow before departure. Every minute erased a little more of that protection. As the plane taxied through slush toward the runway, the crew tried something unusual. They used reverse thrust behind other aircraft, hoping the hot exhaust ahead would help melt the snow on their wings. Instead, the blast of air pushed slush and ice back onto the aircraft and even into the engines. Inside the cockpit, the first officer noticed something troubling. The engine instruments were showing unusually high power readings, numbers that did not seem to match what the engine sounded or felt like. He mentioned it quietly, but the captain pressed on. The airport had already been closed once because of the storm. Delays were building. Turning back for another inspection would mean losing their departure slot. Soon, the control tower cleared them for takeoff. The engines roared as the Boeing accelerated down the slushy runway. Passengers felt the familiar push into their seats as the aircraft lifted into the gray winter sky. From the cabin, everything seemed normal. But 2 invisible dangers were already sealed into the flight. Ice had formed on the sensors that measure engine power, fooling the instruments into showing more thrust than the engines were actually producing. At the same time, a thin layer of snow and ice still clung to the wings, quietly destroying the lift the aircraft needed to climb. The pilots believed they had full power and clean wings. In reality, they had neither. Only seconds after leaving the runway, the climb began to fail. The airspeed stopped increasing, and warning alarms suddenly screamed through the cockpit. The aircraft was losing lift.
Traveling along a highway in North Carolina witnessed something almost unbelievable. Traffic was moving normally when a small aircraft suddenly appeared flying unusually low above the road. At first, many drivers thought the pilot would pull up and fly away. But the aircraft kept descending. Inside the cockpit, the pilot had just discovered a serious problem. The engine had lost power mid-flight. With very few options left and the aircraft rapidly losing altitude, the pilot had to make a life-or-death decision within seconds. Instead of searching for a distant airport, the pilot spotted a straight stretch of highway below. Cars began slowing down as the aircraft dropped lower and lower, its wings stretching across the lanes. Drivers looked up in shock as the plane carefully lined itself up with the road. Then, in an incredibly tense moment, the wheels touched the asphalt. The aircraft rolled down the highway between vehicles before finally coming to a stop. What could have been a catastrophic crash turned into an astonishing escape. Thanks to the pilot's quick thinking and steady control, no drivers were injured, and the pilot walked away safely, proving that sometimes the difference between disaster and survival comes down to a single bold decision. Every time a plane takes off, it carries a hidden risk that almost no one talks about. One unexpected moment, just a single second, can turn calm skies into a brutal test of skill, courage, and survival. What you are about to see are not scenes from a movie. These are real aviation incidents, shocking, terrifying moments captured on camera, where ordinary flights suddenly turned into desperate fights. is to attack the flames from above, carrying thousands of liters of water that can be released in a single dramatic moment. As the aircraft approached the fire, the pilot had to fly dangerously low. Too high, and the water would scatter uselessly in the wind. Too low, and the aircraft could be swallowed by smoke heat or sudden air turbulence created by the flames. With incredible precision, the pilot aligned the aircraft with the burning forest below. The engines thundered while the plane sliced through the smoky sky. Then the moment came. The water release doors opened. A massive cascade of water exploded from the aircraft, pouring down toward the flames like a sudden storm. From the ground, it looked almost like a scene from a superhero movie. But this was not fiction. It was a real battle against one of nature's most destructive forces, fought by pilots who fly straight into danger to protect the land below. The vortex ring danger happens in the sky. Sometimes the threat appears while the aircraft is still on the ground. In this moment, the situation began during what should have been a simple taxi movement. The aircraft was moving across the runway area, preparing for the next phase of the flight. Everything looked routine at first. Then things started to feel wrong. Instead of slowing down or stopping as expected, the aircraft kept moving forward, faster and faster. Witnesses watching the scene began to realize something unusual was happening. The plane did not appear to be under normal control. One question immediately came to mind. Why was the engine still running? In a situation like this, shutting down the engine would normally be the first logical step to stop the aircraft from moving. But for reasons that were not immediately clear, the engine continued running while the aircraft rolled forward. The plane moved dangerously across the ground, creating a tense moment for everyone nearby. flames erupted from the wreckage as thick smoke filled the air. Cars nearby were surrounded by fire, and the quiet area quickly transformed into a chaotic emergency scene. For people in the area, the moment was almost impossible to believe. 1 second, the sky was calm. The next, a burning aircraft had slammed into the ground just meters away. Early reports suggested that something had gone terribly wrong inside the aircraft before the crash. Investigators began looking at the possibility of a cabin door malfunction. There were also concerns that the plane might have been overloaded, which could have affected its ability to remain stable in the air. Whatever the cause, the accident was a powerful reminder of how quickly aviation incidents can unfold. A routine flight turned into a fiery disaster in a matter of moments. As investigators worked to understand exactly what happened, one question remained in the minds of many witnesses. What chain of events in the sky led to such a dramatic crash on the ground? Out on the open water, disaster to immediate action. Both the captain and the first officer of Tafra 3 were detained, while officials tried to determine exactly what had gone wrong. The dramatic footage captured the terrifying moments surrounding the crash, screams confusion, and the unmistakable panic that spreads when a vessel realizes it can't avoid impact. Thankfully, the situation did not turn into a deadly tragedy. But the incident left a powerful reminder for everyone who works at sea. Sometimes all it takes is one missed signal, one delayed reaction, or one wrong decision to place dozens of lives in danger. Sulu ferry collision. A docking maneuver gone terribly wrong. Docking a vessel may look simple from the outside. Ships slow down, adjust their position, and glide carefully toward the pier. But behind the scenes, it requires extreme precision. When a captain misjudges even slightly, thousands of tons of steel can turn a routine maneuver into a frightening accident. On November 4th, in the waters of Sulu, southern Philippines, a small passenger ferry was approaching the dock, preparing to complete what should have been a routine docking procedure. Nearby, a massive car carrier was already positioned along the pier. Everything appeared calm at first. Then something went wrong. Instead of easing smoothly into position, the ferry suddenly veered off its intended path. Witnesses watched as the smaller vessel drifted dangerously toward the towering car carrier. Within seconds, the situation became unavoidable. The ferry slammed directly into the side of the enormous transport ship, the impact echoing across the harbor. Compared to the giant car carrier, the ferry looked tiny, but the collision was still powerful enough to send shock through the dock area. Passengers on board were left stunned as the vessels scraped together during the docking attempt gone wrong. Fortunately, the accident did not result in serious injuries. But the footage quickly spread online, capturing the tense moment when a simple harbor maneuver suddenly turned into a maritime scare. Because when ships are operating in tight spaces, even the smallest miscalculation That's exactly what happened during a frightening incident involving a passenger ferry in Indonesia. The ferry was maneuvering through the harbor, approaching the docking area, where several vessels were already anchored nearby. At first, everything seemed routine. The ferry moved slowly across the water as passengers remained on board, unaware that anything unusual was about to happen. Then suddenly, the vessel began drifting off course. Instead of adjusting its path, the ferry continued moving forward, heading directly toward a tugboat that was anchored beside another ferry. Witnesses quickly realized something was wrong. The ferry didn't appear to be responding to steering commands. Within moments, the situation became unavoidable. The ferry rammed bow first into the anchored tugboat, the heavy hull crashing into the smaller vessel with a loud impact that echoed through the harbor. Passengers and crew were shaken as the vessels collided, leaving bystanders stunned by how quickly the accident had unfolded.
For most people, low-cost airline that had quickly become popular for its cheap fares. The flight was scheduled to travel from Miami to Atlanta with 110 people on board. Families, tourists, and business travelers filled the cabin expecting a short trip north across Florida. The aircraft pushed back from the gate after a delay caused by electrical issues earlier that afternoon. Once the problem was signed off, the flight taxied out and lifted smoothly into the warm Florida sky. From the ground, the jet climbed west over the vast wetlands of the Everglades, beginning what should have been a routine one-hour flight. About 6 minutes after takeoff, something strange began happening inside the cabin. A faint burning smell drifted through the air. Some passengers noticed it first, followed by a dull thump from below the floor. Moments later, the lights flickered and the intercom stopped working. A flight attendant rushed toward the cockpit and shouted the word every pilot fears hearing during flight: fire. The source of that fire was hidden beneath the passengers inside the forward cargo compartment. Boxes loaded into the hold had been labeled as harmless company material, but inside were more than 100 chemical oxygen generators. These devices are normally used to supply oxygen masks if a cabin loses pressure. They were old, improperly handled, and missing the protective caps that prevent them from activating. As the aircraft taxied and climbed, at least one of the generators triggered. The device began producing intense heat and pure oxygen, quickly setting off others nearby. Within minutes, the cargo hold turned into a furnace. The fire burned hotter and hotter while feeding on its own oxygen supply, something normal fire suppression systems could not easily stop. Up in the cockpit, the pilots declared an emergency and requested an immediate return to Miami. Air traffic control cleared them to turn back toward the airport. Their voices sounded calm but urgent as smoke began spreading through the aircraft. Behind them, the fire was already burning through electrical cables and structure beneath the cabin floor. Outside, people in the Everglades would soon see the aircraft descending rapidly toward the swamp. What they did not know was that inside the airplane, the situation had already passed the point of recovery. TWA Flight 800. On the evening of July 17, 1996, a Boeing 747 prepared for departure at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The aircraft was TWA Flight 800, scheduled to fly across the Atlantic to Paris before continuing on to Rome. On board were 230 people, including families, tourists, students, and business travelers beginning an overnight journey to Europe. The weather was clear and calm as the massive jet lifted off from the runway and climbed out over Long Island. From the ground, the aircraft looked like thousands of others that departed New York every year. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats for the long flight ahead, while the crew guided the aircraft steadily upward toward cruising altitude. About 12 minutes after takeoff, the airplane was climbing over the Atlantic Ocean just south of Long Island. Air traffic controllers watched the radar target moving smoothly away from the coast.